The RAF and US AAF went into World War II with the fervent belief that the bomber would always get through. No matter how dense their opponent's air defenses, bombers would still be able to slip through and wipe out their intended targets. However, against the determined opposition of the Luftwaffe, it wasn't long before they were questioning their faith in this military doctrine. Even with the most sophisticated turret defenses of the time, bomber losses were heavy. As the Allies clawed their way deeper into Europe and looked to make a decisive blow against Japan, they could not be complacent. New strategies and technology were needed to ensure victory against two ever more desperate and deadly enemies. When the USAAF began their bombing campaign in Europe, the hope was that tightly boxed formations of heavily armed B-17s would be almost impenetrable to German interceptor attacks. However, the Luftwaffe's fighters always seemed to find a way to crack the defenses of the flying fortresses. As losses mounted, USAAF commanders searched for an answer.
One idea they come up with is to create a B-17 gunship, the YB-40. So what they do is they add another top turret to the B-17. The waist gun position is increased to two 50 caliber machine guns. They're power assisted. They also mount a chin turret on the front of the B-17, throw a whole bunch of ammunition into it, and what they do is they were inserting these YB-40s gunships into the formations of B-17s as they went to Germany, and their job was to add extra firepower into the formation. Unfortunately for the YB-40, once the bomber formations had released their bomb loads, their speed increased. But the YB-40s didn't, so they tended to get left behind and were extremely ineffective. At the end of the day, I think they managed to shoot down two Luftwaffe fighters in their appearance in the European theater. So their appearance is short and they make a quick exit.
As an escort gunship, the YB-40 was a complete failure. 48 sorties were recorded. Just 5 German fighters were claimed shot down for the loss of one gunship. The extra weight of guns and additional turrets slowed the YB-40. After bomb drop, it could not keep pace with the rest of the formation. Despite the failure, the Bendix chin turret was incorporated into the new B-17G, giving it a total of 12 50 caliber machine guns. In Germany, turret development soon caught up with the Allies. Known as the Scrooge of the Atlantic, the Focke-Wulf FW-200 was one of the most heavily armed 4-engine bombers to see Luftwaffe service. Equipped with a forward dorsal powered top turret, the FW-200 was armed with up to 3 20mm cannons, 2 7.92mm waist guns, and 1 rear dorsal 13mm machine gun. It was a formidable opponent, but it had a weakness.
Structurally, there was some weak point in the fuselage because there are quite a number of cases of this aircraft landing quite heavily laden at times and breaking midway down the fuselage. I've seen at least 3 photos of this happening at Bordeaux-Merignac, where the Focke-Wulf 200C, the Courier, was based for anti-Atlantic work.
The Heinkel HE-177. Reaching service in October 1942, the HE-177 was heavily armed. It was the first and only heavy German bomber to mount a remote-controlled dorsal turret long before the B-29 appeared. Even with 720mm, 13mm, and 7.92mm cannons and machine guns, the HE-177 was restricted to strictly maritime and nighttime bombing operations. The Messerschmitt Me-410. Designed to replace the Me-110, the Me-410 was the first twin-engine fighter to be equipped with an advanced rear defense system. Operated by the rear observer, this remote gun system provided good protection over the entire rear hemisphere with very little drag. During 1943, the B-17F bore the brunt of early deep penetration raids into Germany. Losses were horrendous. American commanders clung to the idea of the self-defending bomber, despite the staggering losses. Even with the introduction of the B-17G, with the chin-mounted Bendix turret and improved tail turret, it was still vulnerable to fighter attack. Like the B-17, the consolidated B-24 Liberator entered service with more handheld guns than turrets. Entering RAF service first, British B-24s were equipped with 2 Boulton-Paul top and tail turrets. Each was armed with 4 .303 caliber machine guns. In early combat, the B-24, like the B-17, was vulnerable to head-on attacks. The B-24J model addressed the problem with a nose-mounted Emerson or consolidated turret, armed with 2 50 caliber machine guns. It also carried a Martin top turret, Sperry ball, and a consolidated tail turret. Even with 4 powered turrets, the B-24 was still vulnerable against determined Luftwaffe fighter attacks. In the end, the massed formations of B-17s and B-24s could not defend themselves.
Interestingly enough, during the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe fights their battles and sends their bomber fleets over to England using fighter escort. During the Battle of France, the Luftwaffe learns that their bombers are not invulnerable to fighter attack. They face for the first time monoplane fighters like the Spitfire, Hurricane, and the Curtiss P-36 from the French Air Force. And even though they're victorious in France and Belgium and the Netherlands, the losses they suffered during that battle are quite high. And they begin to realize that their bombers, their Heinkels, their Ju-88s, their Dorniers, and even the Ju-87, without fighter escort, are vulnerable to fighter attack. So during the entire Battle of Britain, the Germans used fighter escort to escort their bombers into England. Of course, this lesson is not learned on the Americans, and they continue with the idea that their bombers in the future would be invulnerable to fighter attack.
By late 1943, the solution was clear. Only long-range escort fighters equipped with drop tanks could provide the heavy bombers with the protection they needed. In over 3.5 years of war, the USAAF lost 6,866 bombers to fighters, flak, and accidents. As the Americans pounded German targets by day and the RAF used the cover of darkness to attack Germany at night, losses to the Luftwaffe night fighters began to rise. New 4-engine bombers like the Short Stirling, Avro Lancaster, and Handley Page Halifax were introduced starting in 1941. Each was equipped with 3 powered turrets, but it wasn't enough. The Short Stirling was the first RAF heavy bomber to enter service. Equipped with Frazer-Nash nose, dorsal, and tail turrets, it was armed with just 6 .303-inch caliber machine guns. The Handley Page Halifax. Introduced in 1942, the Mark I was equipped with the Boulton-Paul nose, mid-upper, and tail turrets. The Boulton-Paul Type E rear turret was the most heavily armed with 4 .303-inch machine guns, and one of the most successful turrets ever produced.
It also has to be remembered that the British bombers, like the Short Stirling, Handley Page Halifax, and Avro Lancaster, were all designed to be day bombers. So when the British adopted their night bombing techniques, they were using a bomber force that was largely equipped for daylight operations. Now, all the new heavy bombers that the British introduced in 1942, they were all equipped with powered turrets, but they were armed only with Browning 303-inch machine guns, which were basically rifle caliber guns. It was a weak armament, and they hadn't really studied how the turret defenses would work at night, because now at night the bombers would be flying as individual aircraft. They would not be flying in formation and have the mutual protection of a large number of guns and overlapping fire. So they had to figure out how to use their trained gunners and turrets at night, and that was a very difficult process.
Developed from the failure of the Avro Manchester, the Avro Lancaster was the supreme bomb carrier. Powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Merlins, it was equipped with Frazer-Nash turrets in the nose, mid-upper, and tail positions. Like the Stirling and Halifax, it was one of the most lightly armed heavy bombers of the war, just 8 rifle caliber 303-inch machine guns. Designed as a day bomber, the Lancaster's turrets were even less effective at night. German night fighters, armed with 20mm and 30mm cannons, simply outgunned and outranged it. The nose turret was all but useless. German night fighters never attacked head-on. The top turret saw little action. Tail gunners were the most active, but their contribution was minor. Spotting an approaching night fighter was difficult, let alone shooting it down. It's not so surprising RAF Bomber Command was slow to acknowledge a Lancaster had shot down a speedy Me-262. Eric Wells, in charge of electronic countermeasures, recalls his experience.
And in fact, our aircraft shot down an Me-262. The authorities would never allow us to confirm it, but I saw it with my own eyes. My 3 block plotting transmitters were working, so I took a moment to go up to the front, sit by the bomb aimer, who's also the front gunner. And as I got there, this aircraft was definitely the M92, and he opened a short burst and the thing just flew up. But the authorities wouldn't accept it. There is a note in my thing, enemy aircraft shot down, but they would not have it as a 262, but it was a 262.
The role of RAF gunners at night was far different from their American counterparts. Many RAF pilots did not want their gunners to open fire. Gunners were strictly used as lookouts, warning pilots of approaching fighters. Many pilots used evasive maneuvers like the corkscrew in order to survive.
It was either corkscrew left or corkscrew right. When the maneuver was called, it would basically turn hard left or hard right, and then would go down into a maneuver where it would basically do a corkscrew, where it would throw off the enemy fighter's aim and the contact. I mean, at night, it's really essential. The radar will give you an early contact. It'll give you a zone of sky to look for. But until you get a visual and can lock in on that visual, then you're not going to get a really essential aiming point, which is what they were looking for.
German night fighter tactics were simple. After locking onto a bomber with their radar, they would approach from below and the rear. They also had a secret weapon.
The Heinkel 219, one of the very innovative and successful features it had was Schräge-Musik. This was a system whereby on top of the cockpit, just between the two crew, were 2 30mm cannon inclined forward at an angle of 60 degrees. With Schräge-Musik, you just flew under the aircraft, identified it. If it was the enemy, you then just blasted off with your cannon and you got him under the belly. And the interesting thing is, on the first ever sortie, operational sortie made by the Heinkel 219, it killed 6 Lancasters in one sortie.
The British heavies had no defense against attacks from below. A small number of Lancasters and Halifaxes were fitted with the Frazer-Nash FN-64 undergun turret. Aiming through the periscope sight proved difficult to overcome, and it was soon deleted. Just like their American counterparts, British heavy bomber losses began to mount. March 30th, 1944. The RAF sends 795 bombers to Nuremberg. On that clear moonlit night, 95 heavy bombers were shot down. For RAF Bomber Command, it's a complete disaster. Unable to defend themselves, the RAF's heavy bombers were at a clear disadvantage. Even before the Nuremberg raid, RAF loss rates were climbing steadily. To help defend the bombers, the RAF formed a top-secret electronics countermeasure unit. Known as Number 100 Group, its job was to disrupt and jam German radar and night fighter communications. What the turrets couldn't do, they would, with powerful airborne jammers. Flying high above the main bomber stream, specially modified Lancasters pumped out a constant stream of electronic noise. Some of the Lancasters also carried German-speaking personnel. Their job was to tune into Luftwaffe night fighter radio frequencies and give false and misleading instructions.
The RAF Lancaster had a normal crew of 7, but the special operator, as we were known as the ABC operator, we were number 8. Our position was a curtain put place right at the bottom steps beneath the mid-upper gunner at the center of the aircraft. Our job was to monitor German frequency. So it's top secret in those days. You go on top of the blip flicker switch, that would eliminate that. I had 3 transmitters, so I could disturb 3 transmissions at the same time. And we were, of course, very vulnerable, first of all because of the visual antennas, and secondly because of the fact that we were broadcasting, so they could home on us. But we had a device called, they had a device called the Benito beacon, which would vector them onto us. And we had a device where we could bend that beacon, so instead of it pointing towards us, it bent it, and they were flying alongside us, beneath us, thinking they were on the right beacon. It's a very clever thing that at the time is brilliant.
So secret was their job that not even the crew they flew with knew what they were doing.
They kept us well apart from the others. And as I say, we were sworn to secrecy. We couldn't talk. We had not even the captain, our skipper, knew what we were doing. No one knew. It's completely and utterly secret. And we were the most unpopular guys on the bloody squadron, I can tell you.
By war's end, some Lancasters were equipped with the automatic gun-laying radar and 2 50 caliber machine guns in the tail. The radar had its limitations. The IFF, Identification Friend or Foe system, had to work perfectly. Even with 99% IFF accuracy, it was estimated that 4 times as many bombers would be shot down compared to night fighters. In total, RAF Bomber Command lost 5,940 heavy bombers. In sharp contrast, just 260 of the speedy turretless Mosquito bombers were lost. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the ultimate expression of the self-defending bomber. The B-29 was a marvel of technology. Fully pressurized, it could fly over 3,000 miles and carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs. Its most unique feature was the revolutionary General Electric remote-controlled turret system. Gunners no longer had to strap themselves into cold, cramped turrets. Equipped with 4 remote-controlled turrets and a gunner in the tail, the B-29 bristled with 12 50 caliber machine guns. There were 4 assigned gunners. 3 manned their turrets from the pressurized position just aft of the wing. The upper and 2 side blister gunners controlled the upper aft turrets and lower rear turret. The bombardier or navigator controlled the front, top, and lower turrets. The tail gunner operated his alone. Designed to allow one gunner to control 2 turrets at once, it doubled his firepower at the flick of a switch.
So in 1944, probably one of the greatest bombers ever developed during World War II enters service. It's the Boeing B-29. It's streamlined, it's fast, it has great high altitude performance, it has a Norden bomb sight, but it's also equipped with the world's first remote-controlled turret system. Developed by General Electric, the system is quite accurate. Each turret is controlled by an analog computer, and what the computer does is it takes care of speed, bullet drop, humidity, temperature, and lead. So the gunner in the B-29 does not have to worry about all those things. All the B-29 gunner has to do is steadily lead his target, and the computer will align the guns onto the target, and all the gunner has to do is pull the trigger.
What made it all work were the 5 central fire control computers. These computers analyzed the gun sight information, parallax, ballistics, and deflection. Electrical signals were then sent to the corresponding turrets, moving the guns into the right firing position. As long as the gunner tracked his target smoothly and adjusted for range, the system was effective. But it wasn't enough. Improvements were continually being made. The AN/APG-15B gun-laying radar. First installed in the B-29B, the new radar was advertised as a can't-miss system. Designed to log on to incoming enemy fighters, the radar proved unreliable and ineffective. Fortunately for B-29 crews, Japanese fighter defenses were feeble at best. After over 31,000 sorties over the Japanese home islands, fighters shot down only 74 B-29s. All told, 360 B-29s were lost to all causes.
As effective as the turret system was on the B-29, like the Germans, the Japanese were quick to adopt and discover one of the weaknesses in the B-29, which again was head-on attack. There was a certain area in front of the B-29 where the guns could not depress enough to cover that area. So the Japanese always tried to make head-on attacks as much as possible. But also, too, the Japanese air defense at the time in 1944 was quite anemic. They didn't have a lot of fighters, they didn't have a lot of well-trained crews, and at the height the B-29s flew, the performance of their fighters at high altitude was extremely poor. So what they adopted was a sort of kamikaze method of attacking the B-29, which was ramming. So they developed special ramming units. Now, it wasn't quite a certain death for the pilots. A lot of times what they tried to do is crash their aircraft into the B-29 and hopefully bail out. But it was an extremely risky job and required a great deal of pilot training in order to, get your fighter crashing into another B-29.
As in Europe, the long-range P-51 escort fighter would prove the best defense against enemy fighter attacks. Korea, 1951. B-29 gunners faced their greatest threat, the Soviet-built MiG-15 swept-wing fighter. Armed with two 23mm and one 37mm cannon, the MiG-15 was a true bomber killer. With its high speed and immense firepower, the MiG-15 could fire well outside the B-29's range. For most B-29 gunners, the swift MiG-15 was little more than a distant blur. Unable to cope with the fast-attacking MiGs, the B-29s were forced to abandon all daylight raids. The Korean War and the buildup of nuclear weapons ushered in a new era, the Cold War. Soviet Russia was now the enemy. Armed with atomic bombs, the US and the Soviet Union now stood toe-to-toe in a world defined by mad, mutually assured destruction. Early nuclear weapons were big and bulky devices. Getting them to a target required an aircraft with intercontinental range. Enter the Convair B-36. Designed to bomb Germany from the US, the B-36 continued the false belief in the self-defending bomber. The B-36 was a behemoth, a wingspan of 230 feet with 6 3,000 horsepower radial engines. Armed with 16 20mm cannon and 8 remote-controlled turrets, the B-36 was the most heavily armed strategic bomber ever produced. The turrets, however, proved problematic. Recoil vibration affected the electrical wiring. Vacuum tubes were jarred loose, causing some electronics to malfunction. Even with its powered turrets, the B-36's ability to defend itself was still an issue. Several parasite fighter concepts were tried, including a trapeze-mounted fighter in the bomb bay and wingtip-mounted RF-84Fs. The concept met with limited success and was soon abandoned. At the same time that the Air Force was developing the monster-sized B-36, they were also looking into a much smaller and cheaper bomber, and one with advanced turrets of its own. At the end of World War II, Douglas created prototypes for an innovative experimental bomber, the XB-42, also known as the Mixmaster. This was a pusher aircraft with 2 engines in the fuselage, driving a pair of contra-rotating propellers in the tail. Placing the props in the tail not only produced a more aerodynamic design, it also left room in the wings for rear-firing retractable machine gun turrets. Although these aircraft could fly at record-setting speeds, and a jet-powered variant was in the works, the project was shelved. The swept-wing Boeing B-47, along with the B-52, spelled the end of the powered turret, but not the Stinger's tail. Both aircraft were equipped with early remote-controlled tail turrets. Early versions of the B-47 carried 2 50 caliber machine guns, later upgunned to the 2 20mm cannon. The B-52 Stratofortress. Operational since 1955, the B-52 is the longest-serving combat aircraft in the U.S. Air Force service. It's also credited with the last air-to-air victories using a powered turret. The early B-52s, the A model through F, were equipped with a manned tail turret, armed with 450 caliber machine gun and the A3A fire control system. The G model moved the gunner to the forward crew compartment, but retained the 450 caliber machine guns. Armament in the B-52H changed to a single 20mm Vulcan cannon. December 18, 1972. Operation Linebacker 2. B-52s strike targets in North Vietnam. The North Vietnamese Air Force reacts with intense flak, SAMs, and MiG interceptors. The B-52 tail gunners were ready. Turning away from their target, B-52 tail gunner Staff Sergeant Samuel Turner tracked an incoming MiG-21. Both engaged the radars. Once in range, Samuel unleashed his quad 50 calibers, scoring hits on the MiG-21. Seconds later, the MiG-21 exploded just after the bomb. Witnessed by another B-52 tail gunner, the kill was confirmed. 6 days later, tail gunner Airman First Class Albert Moore claimed another MiG-21. These two claims, however, were never confirmed by the North Vietnamese Air Force. They were the last fighters to be shot down by a powered gun turret. Today, the powered turret has all but disappeared. There are, however, a few bombers that still have the Stinger's tail. The Tupolev Tu-95 Bear. Like the B-52, the Tu-95 is a Cold War classic. A gunner still mans the rear turret, but his job is all but obsolete. Isolated from the rest of the crew, it can be a lonely proposition. Air Commodore Phil Wilkinson recalls the complications of extracting the tail gunner for a photograph at the Fairford Air Show.
The tail gunner. Where was he? Well, answer, there's no throughway through the aeroplane to get to it. And although he was able to climb in whilst at base, he climbed in by going up onto the revetment, opening the hatch and getting in from ground level, as it were. We're now on the ground at Fairford, and he's about 22 feet above the ground. And he can open his hatch, but he can't get out. So eventually, and it took a long time, we found somebody with a ladder, and out he came, and we then had the complete team photo.
Today, the strategic bomber relies on speed, stealth, and a vast array of electronic countermeasures for protection. The era of the manned powered turret was a short, unsuccessful experiment. While marvels of technology, they could never overcome the grim realities of air-to-air combat. In the end, it was the fighter that always got through.
This is the consolidated B-36 intercontinental bomber, sometimes referred to as the Peacemaker or the Big Stick. It was the largest conventional warplane ever built. It had tremendous range and a great payload. With its 6 piston engines turning, and later 4 more jets burning, the B-36 for many years projected America's military might.
It was a monstrous airplane. It had 6 engines, and they were pusher props. Now later on they hung jet pods on the ends of the wing, but the early models were all piston engines, pushers. It was a huge airplane, and it was designed then to carry atomic weapons.
But by the mid-50s, its sheer size, cruciform shape, and middling performance worked against it in a world of pure jets. However, in its heyday, the 36 was the very pinnacle of successful giantism. Rather surprising given that a decade and a half earlier, the United States had all but abandoned the idea of operating massive aircraft known as XBLRs, or the Experimental Bomber Long Range. The first attempt, the XBLR-1, resulted in the Boeing XB-15. This was an ambitious and useful experiment that demonstrated the importance of 4-engined bombers. The XB-15 carried a crew of 10. However, its 150-foot wingspan proved too large for practical use. But Boeing's next offering, the XB-17, which followed a year later, perfectly met the needs of the Army. Despite the Army Air Force's decision not to proceed with the XB-15, the political mood in 1938 was undergoing a sea change. With the acquisition of total power by the Nazi Party, American military planners had to contemplate a scenario of German domination of Europe, including Britain. In America in 1938, the question being secretly asked was, what if Britain did fall? Perhaps the only way of striking back at the Axis powers in Europe was with the once dismissed experimental bomber long range. The XB-LR2 came together as the XB-19, somewhat bigger than the XB-15, and in fact bigger than any other aircraft in the world at that time. It was to be built by Douglas Aircraft in California. However, by the time the B-19 first flew, the Battle of Britain had already been won, when a few hundred pilots of RAF Fighter Command were just able to halt the Nazi juggernaut. Notwithstanding these events, the B-19 project continued. Some indication of the project's size can be gained from the scope of its planning. The XB-19 required no less than 4 acres of drawings, 500 engineers, and more than 2 million hours of R&D and construction. The wings on their own had a 212-foot span and were over 1/10 of an acre in actual size. The wings also held 4 giant engines. Each one had more than twice the power of those on the B-15 predecessor. The B-19 even had its own hoists for changing the 16-foot propellers and was able to lift its own massive engines on and off the wings. Each wing contained a lighted passageway enabling crew to reach the engines in flight. The 2 massive main tires were 8 foot high, and each was of 24 ply, using 150 miles of rayon cord and 3 miles of steel wire. Such were the proportions of what Douglas liked to refer to as their hemispheric defender. In theory, this behemoth flying machine could fly more than 1/3 of the distance around the world without refueling, perhaps reaching parts of Europe and the return trip too. On June 27, 1941, the B-19 made its first flight from Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica to March Air Force Base. Despite various suggestions to the local press at the time, the B-19 was really a proof-of-concept aircraft to explore what could be learnt about building giant aircraft. The B-19 also presented the same problems and lengthy delays as Boeing had endured with its 4-year development of the B-15. Knowing that many of the lessons recently learnt were already becoming obsolete, Douglas suggested that the B-19 be abandoned. However, the Army remained firm that the XB-LR2 would be delivered. In fact, the Douglas Company's view may have been quite sound, as the war had necessitated that the 2 prototype long-range bombers be ordered 6 months before the B-19 ever flew. The Northrop B-35 and its competitor, the enormous consolidated B-36, would use whatever data could be migrated from Douglas. In fact, the B-35's design was a totally different concept, relying upon advanced flying wing aerodynamics to gain maximum range, an idea that was far ahead of its time. Nevertheless, it was the consolidated XB-36 which the Air Force adopted. It was a symbol of pure 1940s giantism, and likely would have benefited from some of the ideas incorporated in the B-19. However, it was a virtual flying gas tank, carrying with it all the fuel it needed for a there-and-back European mission. The Second World War had come and gone before Consolidated Giant reached production, and as Britain did not fall to Germany, the 36's absence had no impact on the conflict, although its presence became critical in the Cold War that followed. It was during this potentially cataclysmic test that America's peacemaker really came of age. The newly formed Strategic Air Command under General Curtis LeMay would regularly fly to far distant territories just to demonstrate its enormous reach. It was all a very effective show of force, although by the mid-50s, one that was starting to be questioned.
The airplane flew like a glider. It was easy to fly. Anybody could have flown it with 5 hours of stick time. It was a beautiful airplane. It's good that they never had to fly military missions, even with the 4 jet engines which were placed on later.
The success of an earlier Strategic Air Command gamble with the B-47 Stratojet medium bomber demonstrated the need for a faster swept-wing, all-jet-power heavy bomber. Yet Consolidated felt they could still provide a ready answer. The B-60 arrived after a standard 36 fuselage was married to swept wings and tail surfaces. It was propelled by 8 turbojet engines. The concept would have been economical, but advances in in-flight refueling made it no longer necessary for massive fuel loads to be carried. The age of giantism was coming to an end. Strategic Air Command wanted a smaller, faster and more sophisticated heavy bomber, and Boeing's B-52 Stratofortress fitted the bill. And in terms of years of service for dollars spent, the B-52 was able to adapt and evolve in a way Convair's Big Stick never could. Still, credit where it's due. The B-36 was for a number of years America's sole intercontinental bomber and served as an effective deterrent, appropriately earning the type its other nickname, the Peacemaker.
In aviation terms, Konstantin Kalinin's K-7 was a classic exercise of early 1930s giantism, a massive aircraft for the time. And indeed, for years to come, it was destined to break much new ground and many hearts during its relatively short career. Despite the K-7's massive 175-foot wingspan, which was almost twice the aircraft's length, it was not particularly hard to fly, or even to handle. This was due to the fact that it employed a servo tab system on the control surfaces. These allowed the moving surfaces to be literally flown into position with very little effort from the pilot.
We were very interested in the type of controls because they were servo tab controls. At least half of them were servo tab and half were normal controls. They worked together. And it offers a lot of advantages in lightening up the controls, and it also, they are very much less liable to enemy fire. They're not as vulnerable. If you strike the controls, you don't really put them out of action. You've got to put the small tab out of action, and that's a very different cup of tea.
For all that, the K-7, even with its 7 engines, was not the largest winged aircraft ever built. That distinction was still to be held by the German Dornier Doe-X flying boat, which was first flown in 1929. This behemoth aircraft was actually powered by no less than 12 engines and carried passengers who enjoyed unparalleled luxury. 3 Doe-X's were built and flew with relatively few mishaps, although they were never really practical or economically viable. However, also in 1929, another German manufacturer, Junkers, offered its G-38. 2 were built, and like the K-7 that followed, they were giant land planes, but not as large as the Doe-X. The G-38s were nevertheless big, and they also shared something else with K-7. Both aircraft were more or less flying wings, with a limited fuselage, purely to support the tailplane for added stability. With both the K-7 and the G-38, nearly all the aircraft's vital components were placed in their massive wings. The K-7 wing was particularly interesting, as Kalinin chose an elliptical shape, similar to that later employed on the British Spitfire, the American Thunderbolt, and some German Heinkel designs. Elliptical wings, although more difficult to make, have some aerodynamic advantages. The K-7 would have had the largest elliptical wings ever made. Kalinin's vision for the K-7 was that there should be 3 different versions. First, a heavy bomber. This concept would rely upon tremendous defensive fire. The 2 narrow booms that supported the tail would each house gunners, who would be able to reach their positions with the aid of their own powered trolleys connected to the main wing. There were also many other gun positions. The K-7 bristled with machine guns and cannons. There were even gun positions in each of the enormous pontoons that also housed the undercarriage. Kalinin also foresaw the K-7 as a giant military transport, which could carry large numbers of troops and other heavy loads that might even include light tanks, a capability that Soviet military planners had long been interested in. Finally, the K-7 was also seen as a luxury airliner, a passenger plane to challenge even the opulence of the Doe-X, and the exact opposite of what the proletariat revolution was supposed to have been all about. However, if Kalinin's ambition could see no limits to what might be done, a small group of Soviet planners were starting to rethink what had been done. 1933, the year that K-7 first flew, was also the year that the Nazi Party came to power in Germany. Now there were 2 large dictatorships, fascism and communism, both looking to influence Europe with their own dogma for a new world order. And both were highly militaristic. However, there were differences in the needs and thinking of the 2 powers. Germany would ultimately turn to using larger numbers of 2-engine bombers, and in contrast, the Soviets, having to contemplate much greater distances, could see the need for a larger 4-engined aircraft, although nothing like the size or cost of Kalinin's K-7. Soviet planners started to look more closely at a simpler design that they already had. The TB-3 from the Tupolev Bureau was much smaller than the K-7, with an all-up weight of about half of Kalinin's design. True, it had none of the sophistication of the K-7, however it was a proven concept, affordable and, most important, adaptable. Later versions even succeeded in towing a light tank fitted as a glider, the only time in history such a task was ever achieved. The TB-3 became a workhorse of the Soviet Army, and went on to provide years of valuable work long after its expected service life. About the time that the K-7 made its first flight, the United States Army was itself putting together specifications for another very heavy bomber under what would be known as Project A. The Boeing company was to be the successful contender with its Model 294, not quite as big as K-7, but still a very large aircraft indeed. Entering production, the 294 was given the service prefix XB-15. Only one example was ordered because the XB-15 was seen purely as a flying laboratory to test the pros and cons of giant aircraft. From concept to first flight, the project actually took over 4 years to complete. Such was the difficulty developing extra-large aircraft. A year after issuing specifications for the XB-15, the Army Air Corps released another requirement for a multi-engine bomber. Boeing, amongst other companies, were again given a contract to build prototypes. Boeing's XB-17 was flying within 1 year. By the end of 1945, over 12,700 fortresses had been built, and the Second World War come and gone. By contrast, only the one XB-15 was ever completed. However, it served its purpose. Both the US and the Soviets had adequately demonstrated that a large 4-engine bomber could be a practical proposition, but not if it was too sophisticated or too complicated. The B-17 and TB-3 were basic and reliable. What happened to K-7? In November of 1933, during its 11th test flight, it crashed, the result of structural failure. 15 people died in the accident. Although the project did continue for a while, with 2 other prototypes commissioned, they were never finished. With the TB-3 and later the PE-8, Soviet planners established the need for large 4-engine bombers, but not giants. Konstantin Kalinin went on to develop other ambitious aviation projects, including a pure-flying wing and an advanced rocket plane. Sadly, Kalinin was arrested in 1938 and suffered the same fate as so many forward thinkers in Stalin's pre-war purge.